The wind blew hard across the hills of Bethlehem that night. The smell of earth mingled with the aroma of campfires lit by the resting warriors. Among them, a young man with an intense gaze sharpened his blade, sliding the stone over the metal with the precision of someone who already understood that the world belonged to the strongest. His name was JOAB, son of Zeruiah, King David's sister. He grew up in difficult times. Israel was still consolidating as a nation, facing wars and threats on all sides. From a young age, JOAB learned that life was a constant struggle. His uncle David was already a legendary warrior when he was born, and his brothers Abishai and Asahel followed in the same footsteps. There was no room for weakness in that family, only for courage and blood. The first time JOAB held a sword, his hands trembled, but it soon became a part of him, like an extension of his own body. In battles, his fury was like a storm, swift and merciless. But he wasn't just brute force. JOAB knew how to read men, predict their movements, anticipate betrayals. He fought not only with the blade, but with his mind. When David fled from Saul and gathered warriors in the desert, JOAB was one of the first to follow him. His loyalty wasn't blind. He saw in David a leader who would change Israel forever. But he also knew that in times of war, ideals were just words. What really mattered was who was willing to get their hands dirty to ensure victory. And JOAB was, always had been. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Time passed and David's luck changed. Saul died, and the path to the throne of Israel was open. But a king doesn't rule without allies and without enemies. As David established himself as king, a powerful man walked to meet him. Someone who wouldn't accept this new order so easily. Someone who had already tasted war and didn't intend to abandon it. The desert dust was still in the air when the first rumors began to spread. Abner, the powerful commander of Saul's army, the one who for years had pursued David like a hunter after his prey, was now extending his hand in surrender. It was hard to believe, but it was true. He had broken with Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and offered his loyalty to the new king. For David, this was an unexpected gift. Abner wasn't just a skilled soldier, he was a strategist, a man who knew every corner of Israel, every tribal chief, every weakness of the enemy. Having him by his side meant consolidating the kingdom faster, uniting the tribes without the need for more blood. But for JOAB, this news didn't sound like an alliance, but like betrayal. JOAB wasn't a man of long speeches nor of diplomacy. To him, Abner wasn't a repentant deserter. He was the murderer of his brother Asahel. He remembered the scene as if it had happened yesterday. Asahel, young and impetuous, running after Abner in the heat of battle. The old warrior warned him not to insist, but Asahel didn't back down, and in a single blow, Abner's spear pierced his body, leaving him fallen in the middle of the road, like a dead animal on the road. David might be willing to forget the past, but JOAB wasn't. He listened to the king's decision in silence without protesting, but inside, he was already plotting his own plan. Abner entered Hebron in peace. He talked to David, made his promises, shook hands. It seemed that everything was resolved, but when he was preparing to leave, JOAB appeared. His face was serene, his voice firm. "We need to talk alone," he said. Abner hesitated, but accepted. After all, JOAB was the commander of the king's army. What could go wrong? He didn't perceive the danger until he felt the cold blade sink into his stomach, quick and precise, like a strike of war. Abner staggered, trying to understand what had happened, but it was already too late. Blood spread across the floor of Hebron. JOAB stepped back, wiping the blade clean, without remorse. For him, this wasn't a crime, it was justice. But for David, it was a problem. A problem that needed to be resolved before the fury of the new kingdom began to burn from the inside out. The silence in Hebron weighed like lead. Abner's body still lay on the ground when David received the news. The king tore his clothes in mourning, cried before the people, and made it clear that he had no part in that murder. But Joab didn't mourn. He stood, watching everything without showing regret. For him, what was done was done. Abner didn't deserve to live. David might be king, but Joab was the man who did the dirty work. And although David cursed him publicly, deep down he knew he couldn't simply get rid of him. Joab wasn't just a commander, he was a warrior who did what needed to be done. Besides, he had the army in his hands. Time passed and David strengthened his reign. But there was still a problem: Jerusalem. The city was in the hands of the Jebusites, who mocked any attempt at conquest. From the walls, they shouted that even the blind and the crippled could defend that place. But Joab didn't see challenges, he saw opportunities. David launched a challenge. Whoever climbed up the water tunnel first and took the city would be the commander of the army. For many, it seemed impossible. But Joab had already decided that that title belonged to him. In the dead of night, he found the secret passage and climbed through the dark tunnels, feeling the dampness of the stone against his hands. He moved like a predator, silent, lethal. When the Jebusites realized it, it was already too late. In the morning, Jerusalem belonged to David, and Joab once again had secured his place alongside the king. But now, with a city to govern and a kingdom to consolidate, David needed more than just a relentless warrior. He needed someone who understood the games of power, and Joab knew how to play better than anyone. But the real test was yet to come. A new enemy was rising against Israel, and this time the war wouldn't be just on the battlefield, but also within the king's own heart. The city of Jerusalem now belonged to David, and the kingdom of Israel grew stronger every day. But kingdoms aren't maintained with victories alone. There are always enemies lurking, waiting for an opportunity to attack. This time the threat came from the Ammonites. They had insulted David's messengers, shaving off half their beards and tearing their clothes. For David, this was an outrage. For Joab, it was a declaration of war. The army was summoned, and Joab marched ahead of the warriors of Israel. On the battlefield, he saw that the Ammonites weren't alone. They had hired Syrian mercenaries, forming an army that surrounded the Israelites on both sides. Joab wasn't a man of hesitation. Quick as always, he divided his forces. He would face the Syrians, while his brother Abishai would fight against the Ammonites. "If the Syrians are too strong for me, you will help me. If the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will help you." And then, without fear, he launched himself into combat. The dust rose as the swords clanged in the air. The Syrians, seeing Joab's fury, fled even before the fight reached its peak. Without their allies, the Ammonites also lost courage and retreated into Rabbah, their fortress. But Joab wasn't rash. He knew that this war wouldn't end there. He returned to Jerusalem, waiting for the right moment to attack. Sometime later, David sent Joab back to besiege Rabbah. The city was about to fall, and Joab knew that victory was certain. But in an unusual act, he didn't take the city. Instead, he sent a message to David. "Come, finish the conquest and receive the glory, so that it is not I who gives a name to this victory." It was a smart move. Joab knew that the king liked recognition. But while the army was winning on the battlefields, David was fighting a different battle, one that didn't involve swords or spears, but desire and betrayal. While Joab crushed the enemies of Israel, David committed a mistake that would change the fate of them all. The siege of Rabbah continued, but in Jerusalem, David was occupied with another war, one that didn't involve enemy armies, but the uncontrollable desire for a woman who didn't belong to him. Bathsheba, wife of Uriah, one of the king's most loyal soldiers, had become his obsession. The king fell into temptation, and soon sin took its toll. Bathsheba was pregnant. David, in despair, tried to hide his mistake. He called Uriah back from the battlefield and sent him home, hoping that he would sleep with his wife and take the child as his own. But Uriah was a man of honor. How could he enjoy the comfort of home while his brothers in arms slept in tents? He remained among the king's servants, refusing to return home. David ran out of options, and then he wrote a letter. A few words, direct and deadly. Put Uriah in the front line, where the battle is most violent, and retreat so that he is killed. The king sealed the parchment and gave it to Uriah himself to take the message to Joab. Joab read the orders and understood what was happening. But question? No, he wasn't a man of questions. His job was to obey. He chose a vulnerable point in the battle and placed Uriah there. And as planned, the soldier fell, surrounded by the enemies. When the news reached Jerusalem, David breathed a sigh of relief. He took Bathsheba as his wife, and the scandal seemed covered up. But Joab, there on the battlefield, knew the truth, and he knew too that now he carried valuable information, a debt that the king could never repay. But this wouldn't be the only conflict to shake David's heart. While the king tried to move on, a shadow grew inside his own house. The blood of his family would soon be spilled, and this time not even Joab could prevent what was to come. David's palace, which had once been a place of celebration and conquest, was now taken over by the silence of a growing tragedy. The disorder didn't come from the enemies outside, but from within his own house. The blood of his family cried out for justice, and Joab, always attentive to the tides of power, watched closely as the winds changed. Absalom, the king's son, wasn't just handsome and charismatic, he was ambitious. His anger grew like a flame after his sister Tamar was dishonored by Amnon, another son of David. The king, even knowing of the crime, did nothing. But Absalom did. He planned his revenge patiently, and 2 years later ordered Amnon's death during a banquet. The prince fled Jerusalem and remained in exile, waiting for the right moment to return. Joab, always a shrewd player, realized that keeping Absalom away for too long could weaken the kingdom. So he manipulated a wise woman from Tekoa to convince David to bring his son back. The king yielded, but even after Absalom's return, refused to see him for 2 whole years. Absalom, impatient and furious, did what any man of power would do to be noticed. He set fire to Joab's barley fields. It was a clear message, and Joab understood. He took Absalom before the king, and father and son finally reconciled. But by this time, Absalom didn't just want forgiveness. He wanted the throne. Little by little, he won the hearts of the people, promising justice to those who felt forgotten. And when the time was right, he declared himself king and marched against his own father. David fled Jerusalem, leaving behind everything he had built. Joab, however, didn't flee. He knew that sooner or later the war would come, and when Absalom's army and David's faced each other, there would be no room for sentimentality. Joab had already decided what needed to be done. The forest of Ephraim was silent, but carried the weight of an imminent conflict. On one side, Absalom's army, young and ardent, inflamed by promises of a new reign. On the other, those loyal to David, experienced and determined to restore the king to the throne. Among them, Joab, the cold and calculating commander who didn't fight for sentimentality, but for the balance of power. David had given a clear order before the battle began. "Spare my son Absalom." But Joab wasn't a man to obey feelings when the survival of the kingdom was at stake, and the war soon began to lean in favor of the king. Absalom's army, inexperienced and disorganized, was quickly defeated. The soldiers fled through the dense tangle of trees, and it was there, among the twisted branches, that Absalom's fate was sealed. In the midst of the desperate flight, his horse bolted through the forest, and without realizing it, his long hair got caught in an oak tree. The animal moved on, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth. The rebellious prince struggled, but he was trapped, helpless. David's soldiers found him and hesitated. None of them would dare disobey the king. But when Joab arrived and saw the scene, he had no doubts. Without a hint of hesitation, he took 3 darts and plunged them into Absalom's chest. The young man was still breathing when Joab's squires finished the job. There was no mercy. There was no hesitation. Joab knew that as long as Absalom was alive, David's throne would never be secure. The announcement of the death echoed through the field, and the war ended there. But the real storm was yet to come. When David received the news, his pain turned into lamentation, a cry that ran through the entire palace, and Joab, seeing him cry for the one who almost destroyed the kingdom, knew that something had changed. The king was no longer the same, and perhaps for him, Joab wasn't either. David's lament echoed through the corridors of the palace like distant thunder. He didn't mourn the victory, didn't celebrate the end of the rebellion. He mourned Absalom. My son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you." The king was inconsolable, plunged into grief. But Joab didn't see this as grief. He saw it as weakness. The army returned victorious, expecting to find a king who would receive them with honor. But instead, they found a monarch prostrate, lamenting the enemy who had tried to dethrone him. Joab couldn't stand it. He entered the royal chamber uninvited, his words cutting like blades. "Today you have shamed the men who saved your life and your throne." He didn't try to soften the truth. "If Absalom were alive and we all dead, would you be satisfied?" David raised his eyes, still consumed by sadness, but he knew that Joab was telling the truth. The kingdom needed a king, not a grieving father. Slowly he stood up and went out to greet his men, but something between him and Joab had broken. Time passed, and David began to distance himself from his commander. He no longer saw in Joab only a loyal ally, but a dangerous man, willing to do anything to maintain control. When the opportunity arose, he decided to replace him. He chose Amasa, a former commander who had fought alongside Absalom. Maybe it was a gesture of reconciliation, maybe a warning to Joab, but the old warrior wouldn't accept being sidelined so easily. When Amasa left to gather troops in favor of the king, Joab went to meet him. He pretended to greet him with a hug, but his hand held a hidden blade. In a quick strike, he ripped open his stomach, leaving him to fall to the ground, writhing until his last breath. Once again, Joab took for himself what David was trying to take away from him. But now, he wasn't just facing a hesitant king. A new dispute for the throne was approaching, and Joab would have to choose which side to bet his last move on. The years passed, and the once young and fearless King David now carried the weight of age. His body was no longer so strong, his steps were slower, and his eyes carried the shadow of all the battles he fought, both on the battlefield and within his own house. But if David weakened, Joab remained the same, calculating, merciless, and always attentive to the game of power. The succession to the throne became the new war of Israel. Adonijah, one of David's eldest sons, began to act as if he were already king. He surrounded himself with influential allies and organized a banquet, gathering priests, princes, and even Joab. The old commander, always faithful to whoever was in control, placed his bet. He saw in Adonijah a strong future ruler, someone who would continue the tradition of the sword and the authority imposed by blood. But Joab, for the first time, chose the wrong side. In the palace, a silent plot was unfolding. Bathsheba, now queen mother, along with the prophet Nathan, alerted David about the conspiracy. Solomon, the son chosen to reign, had not yet been crowned, but the threat of Adonijah forced the king to act. With a last flash of decision, David ordered Solomon to be anointed as king before all of Jerusalem. The roar of the people echoed through the streets, announcing the new monarch. And as the chants rose in the palace, Adonijah's party became a funeral. His allies realized their mistake and fled. Joab, who had always been one step ahead, saw his position crumble before his eyes. He was no longer the untouchable commander, the man feared in the corridors of power. For the first time, He felt something he had never felt before, the weight of defeat. And when Solomon assumed the throne, Joab knew that he would have no place in the new kingdom. So he did what any cornered man would do. He fled. But there was no escape for someone who had spent his life deciding the fate of others. Now, it was his own destiny that was sealed. The desert of his own mistakes now stretched before him. Joab, the great commander, the man who shaped David's kingdom with his blood-stained hands, was now alone. When he learned that Solomon had ordered his death, he didn't run to the battlefield where he had always been invincible. Instead, he ran to the tabernacle. Heavy footsteps echoed on the sacred floor as he clung to the horns of the altar. The temple was a refuge, a place where no one dared to shed blood. There, Joab wasn't the ruthless commander who dictated the fate of kings and generals. He was just a man awaiting a judgment that he himself had imposed on so many. But Solomon wasn't David. He didn't have the same ties of loyalty, nor the same hesitations. He sent Benaiah, his new commander, with a clear order: kill him. Benaiah arrived and found Joab clinging to the altar, his fingers squeezing the cold metal as if he could, for an instant, hold on to his own life. "Get out of there," Benaiah ordered. But Joab didn't answer. There was nowhere left to run. "If I am to die, I will die here." The blow came swiftly. The man who had so often decided the fate of others now met his own end. His body fell right there, in the place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Blood flowed across the floor, staining the stones that had never been made for war. Solomon's new kingdom would have no room for men like Joab. His time was over. But his story, that was never forgotten. For Joab wasn't just a warrior, he was an architect of Israel's history, a man who fought, killed, and survived until there was nothing left to conquer. And perhaps, as we look back at the trails of blood he left behind, we can see something deeper. Not just a brutal man, but someone who lived in a world where strength was the only currency of value. And, in the end, when that currency ran out, not even an altar could save him. The dust settled, the blood dried, and Joab's name became just an echo in the past. The man who built his life on the edge of a sword fell not by a foreign enemy, but by those he served. The same hand that raised kings was the one that betrayed them, and in the end, the wheel of fate turned against him. But what remains of a man like Joab? What does his story teach us? He was loyal, but a loyalty that often served himself more than the king. When David needed a warrior, Joab was his wall. When David wanted to be merciful, Joab was his sword. He won battles, destroyed enemies, and took cities. But he never knew when to put down the sword. He never understood that power without control turns against the one who wields it. Joab lived in a world where strength decided everything, and for a long time it worked. But kingdoms change, kings change. He bet on Adonijah because he believed that the world should continue as it was, made of war and relentless authority. But Solomon brought something different, a new reign, based not only on military conquests, but on wisdom and strategy. And there was no room for Joab in that future. Looking at his journey, we see a man who never accepted limits. He killed Abner without permission, murdered Amasa for revenge, disobeyed David in the name of reason. But in the end, it was this same attitude that led him to ruin. Joab teaches us that strength opens paths, but without wisdom, they lead to the abyss. That loyalty without discernment can be a trap, and that, no matter how great a man is, no altar can protect him from his own choices. If you enjoyed the story of Joab and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.